Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Happy Monday and welcome to another week. Let's get right to it. Got to watch a little bit of WAGA Fox 5's The Georgia Gang last night and understand that the makeup of this show, the way they produce is pre-recorded on Friday mornings to air the following Sunday. And I mention that because if you go back 2 Fridays, we didn't notice or realize we were having major water main failures in the city of Atlanta until by the time last Sunday's show, in the midst of a big water outage, they had no idea as they were recording that show that all that was going on. So by the time it aired on Sunday, while many of us in Atlanta were peeing in Gatorade bottles because we didn't have working water to flush a toilet with, that show that aired absolutely had no relevance to what was going on in the city of Atlanta at that point in time. It is what it is. It's one of the little quirks that comes with recording a local political discussion show when you pre-record it and package it for a 30-minute broadcast. Some of us aren't as nimble as yours truly, who manages to put a show together each day for about 44 and a half minutes via podcast to air on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com. But I digress. Again, they record that show Friday morning. It airs the following Sunday, a day and a half later. And unfortunately, last week was just one of those rare weeks where the show had zero relevance to what was going on in that moment. So this past Sunday, they finally got around to talking about it. And Theron Johnson and Brian Robinson, Kathy Woolard, who used to be a former she is a former Atlanta City Council person. In fact, I believe a City Council president back in the day, provided some insights on, how things got to where they are, how we move forward, and a little bit of hand-wringing about, oh my God, the World Cup's coming in 2026. What if it happens then? How disastrous and embarrassing would that be for the city, the state, the nation, et cetera, and so on. So this past Sunday's episode, which recorded last Friday, they finally got around to Monday morning quarterbacking the mayor's performance, lack of communication, how we got to where we are. And let's start with the communication part, because that's where they dove in right away.
That's right. And look, the best communicator in the city of Atlanta is Mayor Andre Dickens. He wasn't on site at this moment.
Exactly.
Look, I have some grace about that. I don't expect him to be, standing in Atlanta every minute of every day.
True.
There was an emergency that happened. Yes, he was getting on the plane when it happened, but we did not know that it was going to be as big as it turned out to be. And so I think part of this gap was it looked like there was nobody in power to go and fill the gap while he wasn't here.
Yes.
And we saw, like, overnight, in the early hours, going into Saturday, you woke up, everyone would think you go to the website, you go to the watershed's social media platforms and to get the most up-to-date information. Well, if you got up Saturday morning and you checked those platforms, it had been more than 11 hours since it had been updated. Mm-hmm. People still didn't have water. And so during those times, you got to constantly communicate. Was there some communication on the first day? Yes, there was. Was it enough? No, it wasn't. Because when it comes to water, your entire life stops when you don't have it. Lord, if you have an infant or a toddler, the headache that this is going to cause, I would have just got in a hotel room somewhere else. But tell me, as a constituent, look, it's going to be a while. If you need to go stay at your in-law's house, you go. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do that stuff.
That is conservative pundit Brian Robinson, who I have to say I absolutely agree with. Wow, that's a rarity. I agree with a conservative pundit. Let's frame that. Hang it up on the wall. Nonetheless, no, he's absolutely right. And when you look back at the way things unfolded that weekend, you can go back and check for other city council people. And yes, we have a lot of city council folks we could be following. I would venture to guess that city council president Doug Shipman would be the one to follow. And again, he's sort of relying on the same information that everybody else is when it comes to Atlanta City Watershed. And who before that weekend even knew that there was social media accounts for the Atlanta Watershed Division, for crying out loud. It's such a new, nobody follows that until it becomes newsworthy. And now we're all following the Atlanta Watershed Division, which is going to be a boring social media follow for the near future. The thing that might need to develop is something along the lines of what you get during a hurricane or a tropical storm. I lived in South Carolina on the coast for 11 years, so this is just something. But now that I think about it, it's been since 2018 that I live there, and I know that after a tropical storm or a hurricane, we could go to our power utilities website, if we had power ourselves, or mobile devices. We could go to our power utilities website, and they had outage maps. Maybe that's something that could be developed. And listen, I'm not in favor of throwing a whole bunch of money at something like that, but I got to think in 2024, if it was available in like 2016, 2015, 2014, when I was living in South Carolina and logging on to check out if we were going to get power back anytime soon, I have to think in 2024, it's cheaper and something that can be updated more routinely. Just throwing that out there. And don't worry, I did not hit my head when I woke up this morning or anything like that. I will disagree with Brian Robinson in just a few minutes. You did hear, however, where Brian was willing to give Mayor Andre Dickens some grace. I get it. I'm of the same mind in that, well, the man can't be in city 24/7, 365. It's not that he was in Memphis that's the problem. It's not that he was in Memphis doing a fundraiser that's the problem. It's the fact that there was no apparatus beyond him to have someone step in as a spokesperson for the mayor. The mayor has, his office has personnel that speak for his behalf when necessary. They have spokespeople, right? The city is armed with public relations people, with spokespeople, and there just seemed to be a bit of a vacuum in that regard. Lori Geary, the moderator for the Georgia Gang, pivots to Theron Johnson, who kind of provides a little bit of cover again for the mayor. Listen to this.
Well, Theron, the mayor was out of town in Memphis at a political fundraiser for his campaign, and he had no idea how serious these water main breaks were at the time, but it's just the optics didn't look good. I mean, there are so many water breaks that happen across Georgia, right, with the aging infrastructure. So how was he to know it was going to be this serious?
You're right, and thank you for saying that. And I'm going to agree with Kathy and Brian and kind of carry on what you're saying. So yeah, look, the mayor of Atlanta is the leader of a major city, and he has a re-election campaign that's coming up next year, right? So there's nothing wrong with the mayor of Atlanta going out to raise money. Now, I want to start by saying that I think that it took a lot of courage and it took a lot of leadership for a mayor, any leader. And I think Kathy's the only person that's been elected on this panel. But elected officials are not sort of that trained to want to go out and apologize, right? And so for him to first and foremost take full responsibility, apologize, and say, even though it's not his problem, it's his problem now. And I want to start there because I sympathize with the residents and I sympathize with these business owners. I actually had an event on that Friday, and I was talking to folks at the city, and this business owner where we had the event was very concerned about not just my event, but that he was go on. All right, so I want to start by showing that sympathy, right? And that's what the mayor has done. He's taken ownership of the problem and he's fixing it, right? And he's more so not blaming anyone, but he's going to do it. Now, let's move forward with the facts. B-Rob pointed on something that I think the media hasn't really focused on. When we talk about that there was no communication to the public, my sources tell me that there was 5 press releases sent out on the day of the water main.
That's all fine and well, but press releases are just press releases. That's not, again, an interactive map. That's not hourly persistent updates. The latest 5 press releases. Okay. Do you know, if anybody who's ever worked in a newsroom can tell you, press releases is, oh my God. Tell me next that they came over a fax machine. Believe it or not, y'all, that still happens. People still send faxes out, for crying out loud. Press releases off of fax machines or in info at inboxes that some intern or low-level staffer is having to monitor. Y'all, press releases aren't going to cut it. It's 2024. You have social media. You can even, hell, I'm on a softball league board, and we have everybody who is in our league who participates, coaches, players, etc. We have their cell numbers. We can send them instant updates if games are going to be delayed or canceled because of field conditions, weather, etc., and so on. Somehow we managed to avoid that all this season. We finished our last season, our last slate of games yesterday, and no rainouts. How about that? Anyway, we have that availability. I have to think that if need be, we could also quickly jettison some sort of apparatus to let people opt in for updates via text message that would come to us in a timely manner. press releases? What is this, 1999?
Right, 5 press releases. Also, you had a website that went down. Even on Saturday, you had 3 press releases that went out, and there were multiple press briefings. All right. What I think we got to discuss going forward, and it was so funny, China and my wife said, Darren, stop putting on social media that the board wall advisory is over, that the water is back on, and that the mayor is out there at 2 o'clock in the morning, because I know that as a citizen, I have to play my part to help the mayor and educate the public. What I think the city has got to do is look at, and Kathy touched on this, look at the water system in its totality. Step back, look at where money could be spent. At a time where we're a city that's growing, you see all this growth, all this development, we got to pay more attention to what's going on. And I think that's what the mayor's saying. He's put together this commission. They're going to look at how they can best move forward. And I think more importantly, how people get the information, because not everyone get information from websites, press releases. Oh, and by the way, there were robocalls that went out to impacted people, right? Well, and so I just want to say all this, again, to show empathy and say it was messed up, it was unfortunate, but defend the city a little bit to say that they did try and they're going to figure out going forward.
So can I just also mention, by the way, I didn't get a robocall. I live smack dab in the city. I was in Old Fourth Ward and was out without water from midday Friday, for the most part, until, well, it had to be Sunday after it was well into Sunday. We didn't have water. I never got a robocall. I live in the city. Here's the other thing you got to remember, too, though. Robocalls may not go to someone like myself or anyone else who is renting from a landlord or lives in a condo building where the condo building association or the property management company is the actual payer of the water bill. Which, again, takes us back to what Theron said. I will give him credit for that. Yes, we have to look at the way people get information nowadays and maybe adapt, which takes me back to kind of chortling and bristling at his, hey, there were 5 press releases on Friday and there were 3 on Saturday and press briefings. People are on the go. People are on the move. We're not stopping to tune into a local analog TV station to get a press brief. And actually, how many times over the course of a weekend did a TV station or even a radio station break into their regular programming to update us with a press briefing about the city's water outage? I mean, I was on the go, so I didn't get to watch a whole lot of television that weekend. I will say this, because of the consolidation of the broadcast industry, and I'm talking radio and television, you can look back. I mean, just for gits and shiggles, go back and look, say, at a pop radio station or an R&B or a country station owned by iHeartMedia with stations here in Atlanta. Go back and look at The Bull, 94.9. Is it 94.9 The Bull? Go look at 96.1 FM. Go back and look at whatever the pop station is now. It's 105.7, 3. Anyway, go back and look at their social media. You're not going to find anything about the water outage. You're not. You're going to find a bunch of corporate-generated stuff that is, national pop culture headlines, because those are, scheduled to run and they get blasted out nationally from their social media division. But there was nothing local about. So, and a lot of the talent is voice tracked from other parts of the country. You weren't getting timely updates from local media. So again, Theron's right. You have to look at the way people are getting their information, but you also have to look at the media landscape now and realize you don't have a whole lot of help there. You have a lot of organic, local journalism happening. I can think of Donnell Suggs at the Atlanta Voice. We have him on quite frequently. Those folks are on top of things, but they're not mass appeal, or they are mass appeal. They're not mass consumed journalistic entities. The Atlanta Community Press Collective, another one. Those are grassroots, on-the-ground organizers. We had George Cheedy on. George Cheedy was more informative than the Atlanta Watershed Division was when it came to giving us timely updates, because he was actually showing us photos and telling us what they were working on in a more timely manner. Anyway, I've got more to talk about this because Brian Robinson goes off on this whole, the city should have been doing this in the 1980s business, blah, 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 blah. But he lacks a little bit of a historical perspective on that. When The Ron Show returns, we'll dive into that perspective. This is The Ron Show on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, or wherever you podcast. I am but a mere mortal human being, just a pedestrian sidebar kind of conversational guy. Host of The Ron Show, at Ron Show ETL on your preferred social media platform, by the way. So forgive me if I don't know when some major office complex or hotel tower or a new mixed-use development's being built, forgive me if I don't know that when they are taking the construction into the city street, and by the way, Atlanta's one of those major cities that annoyingly does this, where instead of insisting that scaffolding go up along the sidewalk, that they are given a lane of juniper or Piedmont to spill over and let their construction happen, which of course clogs up traffic. It's chef's kiss, just beautiful. Love that. Forgive me if I don't know if while they're doing that, while they're tapping into the city's existing infrastructure, while you're down there, does the city also come in and check the piping to address maybe the fact that they're tapping into a 150-year-old pipe, as we found out we still had in Midtown from the 1880s last week? Kathy Woolard, who used to be on city council, she was city council president. She also doesn't know if they're doing that. I want you to listen to her. She gives a little bit of a historical perspective from when she was on council with Mayor Shirley Franklin, and they had to pour a ton of money into the city's aging sewer system.
Well, Kathy, when you were city council president and under former Mayor Shirley Franklin, she made it a priority in her administration to fix the aging sewer pipes, which was not an easy sell to constituents, but we see what happens when we don't deal with an aging infrastructure. We've got the AJC editorial board, I thought, did a really great job of laying this out. You know, we are hosting the World Cup in 2 years. Are we going to be praying that this just doesn't happen? I mean, what can be done in 2 years?
Well, I think what's going to have to happen is to triage where the biggest, critical spots are and then address them very, very quickly. But, back to your thought, when Shirley and I were in office, we had to really do some very severe things because of the consent decree. We had to institute a 1-cent sales tax and then a graduated fees for water and sewer that were the highest in the country at the time. It was very, very painful. Now we've got another most, but in the ensuing time, none of the mayors have done anything, and the city council here and previously have really not asked for an accounting on where that money's been spent. I'd like to know what the total is, but it runs into the billions. And if we're still, digging holes in Midtown everywhere you go for, big things being built, why are we not replacing the infrastructure there? Maybe we are, but somebody needs to say it, and that's part of the problem.
Yes, absolutely. We need to be insisting when we let these audacious, gaudy new developments pop up. There needs to be in the impact fee, if it's not already there, and again, a former city council president has no idea. If it's not already there, that needs to be part of the impact fee. Oh, by the way, when you're going to go tapping into our new infrastructure, if you're tapping into something like a utility pipe that is, say, I don't know, more than 50 years old, you're going to have to contribute to us replacing that because obviously you're going to be adding more demand and stress to it. We've got to replace it anyway. So mostly due to your developing, got to help us out here. Meet us halfway. 50% of it, maybe? I don't know.
That's a good point because, we see these big, huge monstrosity structures going up, apartment buildings going up. What about the impact fees? Are they high enough? Are we going to take a deep dive into all of the fees that are being collected and where the money's being spent?
Well, there's, on the one hand, this is a great time to do some investment because we're still growing. Our economy is at full employment and tax revenues coming into the city are pretty strong. And under the Biden administration, they've been putting federal money into a money gun and just shooting it everywhere. So instead of doing it in a way that's not smart, in a way that causes inflation, let's put it into infrastructure. And they have been doing some of that, but we need more of that. But the downside of right now is that because we're at full employment, labor and parts, and with inflation, the cost of building is much more than it would have been 3 years ago. Look, this should have been happening in the 80s and the 90s, and it didn't. And the current residents of Atlanta are going to pay a price for it. And to some degree, probably taxpayers at large, because so much of this region comes into Atlanta to do with shopping, to dine out, to consume entertainment. So we're all going to play a role in getting this built. But in the long run, it's worth it. What concerns me, and this is since I'm the one Republican on here, if I could just make this little soapbox statement, part of why we don't invest in infrastructure today is because we as Americans have decided to spend 2/3 of our tax dollars on entitlement spending. That's where it's going, and it is the truth. We can't build the Hoover Dam anymore. We can't build the interstate system anymore
because Republicans won't spend any money on government. That's why.
Damn, Kathy Woolard comes right on in. And by the way, what a derailment, what a deviation off the topic to make a rail on entitlement spending. And by the way, I could sit here and go off on a whole like left, right. This is where conservatives really kind of screw the pooch a little bit. They want to talk about fiscal conservatism, but they actually just prolong the problems that sort of entitlement spending is set to address, or it was put together to address in the first place. Also, he dropped a little nugget that's going to lead me to my next conversation, and that's about what Atlanta should have been doing in the 1980s and the 1990s. Yeah, there are a lot of things that Atlanta should have been doing in the 1980s and the 1990s, but he lacks some historical perspective, surprise, surprise, when it comes to discussing what Atlanta should have been doing in the throes of the white flight era. I'm at least glad to hear he talk about this being a regional issue. I would like to actually stretch that a little bit further. This is not just a regional issue. And by the way, how are we going to get Cobb County and Gwinnett County and Clayton County to chip in? We're not. I mean, there's no mechanism to make that happen unless maybe there was something that could be done at the state level. And speaking of a lack of communication, have you checked Governor Brian Kemp's social media? There is still not word one about this. If we're looking for a vacuum of leadership when it came to this crisis last weekend, a lack of communication, look there. Back after this.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
And I guess I should mention, by the way, since we're now 9 days from Aquapocalypse 2024 here in Atlanta, that we have water. I mean, I'm sure that they say that there are main outages or main breaks all the time, but we've got water flowing. We don't even have a boil advisory anymore. It's like we're living in a, first world country in the 21st century. I wanted to get back to something that conservative pundit, Republican strategist Brian Robinson, who runs a Republican strategy company, I guess, a consulting firm called Robinson Republic. He used to be the chief of staff of Governor Nathan Deal back in the 2011 to 2019 era. Brian Robinson said in the clip that I aired just a few minutes ago on yesterday's The Georgia Gang, with regards to expending money to repair and replace Atlanta's aging city infrastructure.
Look, this should have been happening in the 80s and the 90s, and it didn't, and the current residents of Atlanta are going to pay a price for it.
Here's what Brian Robinson leaves out: the loss of population for the city of Atlanta. Loss of population means loss of tax revenue from the loss of population. Also, the loss of business tax revenue from the loss of population, because the business follows the population, right? And by the way, Metro Atlanta was growing in this era, but the city of Atlanta was not. Hear me out. 1970s population, 496,973. And by the way, let me also point out that the metro population at that time was 1.7 million. The city of Atlanta, 496,000. Metro area, 1.7 million. Fast forward 10 years later, the city of Atlanta had lost 14% of its population. That's right. It went from 496,973, nearly 497,000, to 425,000, a loss of 14%. The metro area, however, grew from 1.7 million to 2.2 million. I mean, it's almost a direct correlation of population growth for the metro area, but the city's population lost 14%. You go another 10 years, the city is now down from 425,000 to 394,000. Or actually, if you look at that 20-year swing, the city lost 20% of its population, which means 20% of its tax coffers, which means when the business follows the population out, they're losing that too. The city was hemorrhaging money while the metro area continued to grow. It went from 1.7 million in 1970 to 2.9 million in 1990, a growth of nearly 700,000 just from 1980 to 1990. So the city was losing population, did not see that swing come until somewhere in the 1990s when the city started to grow again. And by the way, we're back closer. In fact, I think we just saw we're over 500,000 for the first time ever. But that took nearly 50 years to see that swing go from nearly 500,000 back to over 500,000 for the city's population. It's nice to say, oh, what the city should have been doing in 1980, 1990. The city was losing its ass in tax coffers and in population from 1980 to 1990. And by the way, again, I point out Brian Robinson was chief of staff for Governor Nathan Deal from 2011 to 2019. What kind of money was the state offering the city of Atlanta to deal with its aging infrastructure then? Awkward. By the way, for those asking, again, if you want to push back and say, well, why is this the governor's problem? Well, the governor's trying to deal with it. He has said not word one. Not word one. We want to talk about lack of communication. There was no communication. And why is it when it's something like, I don't know, just providing a basic necessity to the citizens of Atlanta, Brian Kemp has nothing to say. But when he sees, some red meat opportunity, crime. Remember when crime was such a big deal in the city of Atlanta during the pandemic? He was ready to swoop in with the Georgia State Patrol and was very vocal about it all over social media. Of course, he wanted to embarrass the then mayor at the time, Keisha Lance Bottoms. And there seems to be a little bit of symbiosis with he and Mayor Andre Dickens because of the Atlanta Public Safety Training Facility, which they both covet. The governor, by the way, has said something in recent months about dealing with infrastructure, but not the kind of infrastructure you think of. This was from January, WXIA TV 11 Live reporting on this.
All new tonight, Governor Brian Kemp wants to revamp Georgia's infrastructure. He made this announcement during the Georgia Chamber's Eggs and Issues breakfast this morning. So the governor plans to spend an additional $1.8 billion on infrastructure. Most of that would go to the Department of Transportation to speed up work on the agency's long list of projects.
That's right. According to U.S. News World Report, at this Georgia Chamber breakfast conversation, Kemp says he wants to allot $1.5 billion to the Georgia Department of Transportation to speed planned road work and establish a freight infrastructure program. $200 million of that money would go to cities and counties, increasing what the state sends local governments, okay, we're listening, to maintain their own roads and bridges. Not aging water or sewage needs. And again, as I'm putting this show together, it is a little bit after 9 o'clock. You'll be hearing it after 9:30, obviously, because there's a little bit of a delay because I'm not live. Governor Brian Kemp has still said not word one about Atlanta's aging water infrastructure. And while we're talking about investments from folks other than residents of the city of Atlanta or the city of Atlanta and going to its tax coffers, King Williams, friend of the show, we've had him on here a few times, had a guest op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Maybe I need to reach out to him. Does he work for them? This would be great. No, he's a heck of a writer, and he's just a profound student of the history and the sociology of the city of Atlanta. I'm glad to see that he is getting press in the AJC. He wrote an op-ed, the headline, "The Atlanta Water Crisis is an Opportunity to Make a Big Ask," to Biden. The city is used to being left on red by the White House. No more, King Williams writes. I'm going to give you this op-ed. And he's not wrong. Again, Mayor Andre Dickens is firmly entrenched in the Biden-Harris reelection apparatus, and they are somewhat close. King Williams is kind of right on this. Okay, maybe we get a little bit more money. And again, bear in mind that the Infrastructure Act that was passed in the first Biden presidency was historic and, by the way, also long overdue. Something that, again, former President Trump said he wanted to pass, couldn't get it passed. Obama tried to get it passed from 2009 to 2016, and Republicans didn't want to pass anything that was going to do any good for anybody because it would have looked good for Obama, and we can't have that happen. King Williams writes, "There are no boring news weeks in Atlanta. This past week and a half has been no exception. The city was in relative distress for 6 days because of several water-related outages. These outages stem from aging infrastructure, ranging from a few decades more than a century old, and are a product of decades of incompetence, neglect, and structural racism, all coming to a pressure point." I'm glad he mentions that because it's absolutely true. And the pundits like Brian Robinson don't want to mention that. With the unwanted national attention brought to Atlanta, and especially to Mayor Andre Dickens, it is time for the city to ask the Biden administration to give Atlanta the funds needed to address its infrastructure. Notice that he leapfrogs the state because, again, this doesn't even seem to be on the governor's radar. Why would we expect the governor to address this when he has his eyes set on more road infrastructure spending, the Georgia Department of Transportation. Yes, we need more flyways and convoluted expressway interchanges. I mean, we do need them, don't get me wrong, but we don't blink or bat an eyelash when it comes to throwing $1.5 billion at the Georgia Department of Transportation, but we hand-wring over even thinking about that kind of money going towards mass transit. Oh, not mass transit. King Williams continues, the Biden administration has made a big bet on repairing infrastructure projects across the country. He's absolutely right about that. The president's ambitious Build Back Better framework has been the hallmark of his tenure. Still, Atlanta, which helped deliver the White House nearly 4 years ago, has been at the short end of the stick regarding financial support. The administration relied heavily on Atlanta's coalitions and political apparatus to win, but has allocated minor funding to the city, he writes. Atlanta has seen more money flowing into smaller initiatives, including the American Rescue Plan Act funds, electric vehicle charging stations, solar panels, park and feasibility studies for high-speed rail. These are all good, but they are small steps toward the larger goal of a better Atlanta, King Williams writes. When it comes to the significant big-ticket needs such as building out mass transit, funding for more affordable housing, environmental cleanups, and water infrastructure needs, the city is still being left on red by the White House. I would argue that at least they're being left on red. That is, it's a colloquial term to, like when you send a DM or a Facebook message, and you can see, or a text message, you can see somebody read it, but they're not responding. That's what being left on red means. I would argue at least we're getting the red notifications from the White House. What are we getting from the governor's mansion, which, by the way, is in the city of Atlanta? King Williams continues, despite being arguably the most crucial state in the 2020 election, Georgia isn't even one of the 10 most funded by the Biden administration. Of the billions of dollars allocated to the state of Georgia, most of which is going toward the maintenance of roads and bridges. See, we're just so hyper focused on, and don't get me wrong, traffic's a problem. Very little is going towards water infrastructure, King Williams continues. Of those funds, $510 million goes towards clean water, and $95.5 million is for restoring water pipes statewide. Consider that much of the damage from the water main breaks was in black communities, King Williams writes, that were built in the Jim Crow era as deliberate floodplains for white neighborhoods and businesses. The ongoing flooding, bursting pipes, and sewage overflow is a result of structural racism and intentional neglect, King Williams writes. Hear, hear. And despite the uptick in new residents and real estate developments, the lingering effects of these past decisions remain, hurting the city now more than ever. King continues, gentrification, redevelopment, and new construction projects have significantly changed Atlanta's landscape. I'm having trouble saying significantly today, making the need for corresponding infrastructure more pressing than ever. Atlanta is still a low-density city, he's right, but it faces a future in which the core city and the region are at a much greater capacity than they are today, and that capacity that will require significant infrastructure investment to meet demand. For an administration that wants to have its cake and eat it too, building more, funding communities, tackling big-ticket infrastructure projects, and addressing past inequalities, investing in Atlanta's infrastructure would be a greater, more tangible show of support. King Williams' op-ed continues, by the way, you know it'll be in the show notes at ronshowetl.com. Atlanta is the region's economic anchor, and the billions allocated to addressing contemporary issues aren't enough. The city has allocated $1.6 billion in funds to address water issues, but identifies another larger need of $8.7 billion in repairs to the system. This is in addition to other needs in the metro area. DeKalb County, Atlanta's neighbor, is looking to increase its spending on water-related issues. And by the way, this is where I'm going to again mention the state has $16 billion in surplus. Hello, Brian Kemp, are you here? The governor's mansion you live in the city of Atlanta, are you stopping by to check to see how your water is? Are you under a boil advisory anymore, Governor? Do you have anything to say? Anything? King Williams' op-ed continues. One recent estimate states that it would take $200 million a year for 30 years to repair and rebuild Metro Atlanta's water infrastructure. And by the way, does that even include, on top of building out new when it's needed. On a macro view, a joint pitch for additional funds for Atlanta, Fulton, DeKalb, Clayton, Cobb, and Gwinnett counties could be the true infrastructure legacy of the Biden administration, doing more than any of the previous presidents and governors combined. And don't think, by the way, Atlanta is the only city in this situation. We just saw Jackson, Mississippi going through this for the same reasons. Their population had been eviscerated through the out-migration, the white flight era, and leaving residents who are, of course, having to foot the bill for all of the infrastructure needs of a larger footprint than the population actually needs, but the region does. Again, Atlanta's not the only city like this. King Williams concludes his op-ed, considering the president's current tepid poll numbers, instead of hosting repeated meet and greets in Atlanta, which, by the way, tax our infrastructure as well, he could jumpstart his campaign in Georgia by adequately funding the state that helped put him in the White House in the first place. Great op-ed from King Williams. Again, friend of the show. We'll include that in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Now, I'm uncertain if King Williams actually believes that President Biden writing a sugar daddy check to Mayor Andre Dickens is going to deal with poll numbers here in Atlanta. I'm not all that certain it would put a dent in the deficit that polling seems to perceive he has in the race for Georgia's electoral votes. I will say this, though. If the city needs, I don't know, they project $8.7 billion. If President Joe Biden said, you know what? I made $4 billion on this little oil gambit I did. Oh, yeah. Did you hear about that? Yeah. So President Biden, remember, we were all hand-wringing. Well, I say we all. Those on the right were hand-wringing when he sold off about half of the nation's strategic oil reserves, right? And I'll dive into that a little bit here in the next segment. Suffice to say, the president made a profit on that, a $4 billion profit. What if he were to just turn around and say, you know what? I just saw a major city, one of our 10 largest cities in the country, have a major water infrastructure crisis that needs to be dealt with immediately. Because we're a World Cup city, we've got the World Cup coming in 2026. We need to avert, being embarrassed on a global scale. Whether he is or isn't president at that time, we all know if he's not, that the next guy is not going to address it and blame everyone else for not dealing with it. So, hey, I got $4 billion burning a hole in my pocket. What if I put that $4 billion directly to that problem right then and there? I mean, it's $4 billion he earned that money. He made that money in a shrewd strategic oil reserve gambit that paid off. So why not put it towards the city of Atlanta's aging water infrastructure? Because you can't expect the governor of the Georgia to do that with $16 billion not exactly burning a hole in his pocket. He's ready to just slash taxes or send rebates. We'll get a little $300 check and, think that that's good for us. Well, we don't have water for an entire weekend. And for folks who were having to flee and stay in hotels, that $300 didn't even cover your hotel tab, did it? Back after this, we'll talk about the Biden gas gambit when we return here on The Ron Show. So we're in the final stretch here of The Ron Show, and something that I think we're going to see impact us at the gas pumps here very soon. Joe Biden and his shrewd maneuvering when it comes to the oil markets on the global scale. I'm going to let Chris Hayes at MSNBC explain this because it's a little complex, but I think he explains it in a way that makes a lot of sense.
Joe Biden just broke OPEC.
Whoa.
And he did that through a truly incredible bit of oil market trading. Here's how The Economist describes it. In 2022, when he released 180 million barrels of crude, he sold at an average of $95 a barrel. In July last year, when oil was at $67 a barrel, he began to refill the reserve. He has replaced about 1/5 of what he sold, posting a profit of $582 million, and has managed to time the market to perfection.
Wow.
And Biden's streak is still going. Here to explain it all is Dan Dickert. He's one of the foremost experts on oil and energy markets, founder of the Energy Word newsletter. And back in October 2022, he really called this whole thing in a piece titled, Joe Biden is the greatest oil trader ever. This has gotten very little coverage. I think it's a wild story.
Great.
Take us back to the origins of this.
Right. So 2 years ago, what we had was the most bullish oil market I had seen in 40 years.
Bullish meaning prices are high.
Yeah, prices are going to, and they're going to go higher because what you had is you're coming out of a pandemic. you've got this demand, this pent-up demand. People want to go traveling. They want to get back into the world.
They want to fly. They want to drive.
That means oil prices are going to go up, okay? Now you have oil companies who during the pandemic got decimated by the pandemic. They can't cover the oil that's being demanded at the time.
Right.
And to add on top of that, you've got a new war, the Ukrainians and the Russians. And now what the Europeans want to do and Joe Biden wants to do is they want to freeze Russian supplies out using sanctions. They want to make sure that the Russians can't use their oil machine to finance the war.
Because their oil machine is the biggest export they have. It's how they finance it.
All of this combined makes for the most bullish market that I ever saw.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not sure if he's going to mention this, but I have to also point out that because of a Trump and OPEC deal that was put into place in 2020, April of 2020, I believe, there was a 2-year throttling back of production by OPEC as well. He talks about all the supply and demand problems, plenty of demand, not a lot of supply, and OPEC was contributing to that because of a deal that they had brokered with then President Donald Trump to throttle back supply. For some reason, they decided to do it in a 2-year swath instead of in 6-month increments, and that was causing gas prices to spike nationwide.
And people were going around putting stickers on oil, on gas, and gas stations saying, with Joe Biden saying, I did
this, right. And we had $5.50 gasoline here. We had $7.50, $8 gasoline in California. Joe Biden goes to Saudi Arabia and does what other presidents do, and he begs the Saudis for oil.
After being very harsh on MBS, who, of course...
Remember the fist bump?
Yes, he gave
photo of the fist bump.
After being very harsh on MBS, rightly, after he had ordered the execution of an American newspaper columnist, various other human rights violations, goes back, does what American presidents do. Hey, buddy, we need the oil.
We need the oil. And MBS tells him to, go stuff yourself, because he's not getting the transactional kind of deal that he got from Trump, who forgot about the Khashoggi murder.
Of course, who's not going to give him a hard time.
Who sold him F-35, fighters. There was this whole transactional deal, and at this point, MBS is saying, "You're going to give me something," and Biden says, "No, I have nothing but the United States to give you." And MBS says, forget it. So he goes back home and he hatches this enormously interesting, aggressive plan to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is our national emergency reserve system, to try and hedge down oil prices.
Okay, I want to be clear here. We're sitting on a bunch of barrels. They actually exist in some cave somewhere.
They do, about 580 some odd million barrels of it.
And the idea is, if we're ever in an emergency in which we don't have any access to oil, this is the strategic reserve.
We used it, for example, in Hurricane Katrina. That was a major time when this stuff was released. But in Katrina, they released maybe 26 million barrels of oil. In this case, over the course of a year, they released 180 million barrels.
No one had ever done anything like this.
Very aggressive. And personally,
basically, because as he's increasing the supply, he's like, oh, you're going to keep supply. You want to keep prices high. Well, guess what? We're going to put a bunch of oil in the market and drive the price down.
Right. And
we're going to sell it into the market.
We're going to sell it into the market. And more than that, we're going to look all the other traders in the eye, and we're going to say to them, if you want to buy oil, the guy standing on the other end of this trade is the U.S. Treasury, the government of the United States. And that's the bejesus out of every trader. And traders started to drop their own positions in oil. They were helping drive the price of oil down while the government was selling it, because nobody wants to be long oil when the U.S. government is telling the world, telling all the traders, we want to see prices lower, and we're going to do what we need to do to make those prices
so
go lower.
They're coming to the market. They're saying two things. We want this price to go down.
Right.
And we're sitting on these barrels, and we're going to sell until it does go down.
Until it goes down.
Watch.
It's exactly what he did. And so the amount of money he made for the U.S. Treasury, this is the fun part of it, is that he sold basically around $100 a barrel. And he's been buying it back around $70 a barrel. That's $30 that he's made on about 200 million barrels. That's, somewhere between $5-6 billion he's made for the U.S. Treasury. And that's why I said that Joe Biden is the greatest oil trader ever.
In other words, Sleepy Joe outmaneuvered OPEC, who, by the way, over the weekend, according to Yahoo Finance, said OPEC and its allies over the weekend agreed to start rolling back some production cuts starting in October, earlier than many market watchers had expected. The curbs will continue in full in the third quarter before gradually phasing out over the following 12 months. Expect gas prices to be lowering. Sleepy Joe does it again. That's it for The Ron Show. Show notes at ronshowatl.com. Replays 5 to 6 p.m. on the America One Radio app and on demand all day at progressivevoices.com or wherever you podcast. Have a great Monday.